An 87-year-old man was humiliated when he asked for a simple sandwich at a cafe when something happened. Subscribe and like the video. Walter Thompson adjusted his cap, looking at himself in the hallway mirror. The lines on his face spoke of decades gone by, some filled with joy, others marked by loss. He gave himself a small nod and reached for his cane, steadying his frame before heading out. Today was Café Day, the one outing he never skipped. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of purpose. The world outside was bustling as usual. Walter ambled along the sidewalk, his movements slow but deliberate. The Sunrise Café was only a few blocks away, a place that had been part of his weekly routine since it opened. Over the years, the cafe had evolved. Once a cozy little corner where locals gathered to chat, it was now sleek, modern, and crowded with younger patrons. But Walter liked the familiarity of it, even if it wasn't quite the same. The cafe door jingled as he pushed it open, the sound of frothing milk and lively conversation hitting his ears. Walter paused for a moment, taking in the scene. The tables were full of people scrolling on their phones, typing on laptops, and sipping drinks that sounded more like dessert than coffee. He shuffled toward the counter, squinting at the glowing digital menu board. Its rows of options overwhelmed him: specialty drinks, seasonal items, and endless variations of sandwiches. Walter just wanted something simple. A young barista with a sharp jawline and an impatient expression greeted him with a clipped, "What can I get you?" Walter leaned slightly forward, gripping his cane. "A turkey sandwich, please," he said, his voice steady but quiet. The barista barely looked up from the register. "What kind of bread?" Regular bread?" Walter replied hesitantly. "We don't have regular bread." "Do you mean white, whole wheat, sourdough?" The barista's tone bordered on condescending. "Whole wheat, I suppose," Walter said, adjusting his cap nervously. "And no extras. Just plain." The barista tapped the screen quickly, then turned back to him. "That's $8.50. Walter fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a handful of coins. His hands trembled slightly as he began to count them, feeling the pressure of the growing line behind him. "I think this should cover it," he said, placing the coins on the counter. The barista raised an eyebrow, glancing at the pile of nickels and dimes. He let out a short, sharp laugh, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. "Seriously? You don't even have enough for a sandwich?" Walter felt a wave of heat rise to his face. The murmur of nearby customers grew louder, and he imagined them whispering about him, judging him. He quickly scooped up his change, his fingers fumbling as he dropped a few coins onto the floor. His humiliation was complete. "Never mind," he mumbled, turning away. His voice was barely audible, even to himself. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped back out into the crisp autumn air. Walter gripped the handle of his cane tightly, his heart heavy. He stood there for a moment, staring at the cafe sign with its bright, trendy lettering. The world had moved on without him, he thought, leaving him in its shadow. Inside the cafe, Emma Carter sat at a corner table, her laptop open and camera bag by her side. She had been editing photos for her portfolio when the scene at the counter caught her attention. Emma's stomach turned as she watched the old man leave. She didn't know his name, but the defeated look in his eyes stayed with her. It wasn't just the coins scattered on the floor or the barista's dismissive laugh, it was the way the man's shoulders slumped as he walked out, as if he had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. Emma glanced around the cafe, expecting someone else to react, to say something. No one did. Most were absorbed in their own lives, sipping lattes and scrolling on their phones. She pulled out her camera instinctively, but after a second's hesitation, she put it down again. This wasn't a moment to capture for art. It was a moment to act. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen as she began typing furiously. She couldn't shake the image of the old man leaving, and she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't right. Emma Carter couldn't shake the image of the man leaving the cafe. She sat at her corner table, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The noise of the cafe buzzed around her, but all she could hear was the barista's mocking laugh and the soft murmur of the man's defeated voice. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed moments like this, but this time felt different. She had seen the look in his eyes, a mixture of shame, sadness, and a deep loneliness that spoke volumes. Emma wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but she knew she had to say something. She opened her social media app and started typing. Just watched an elderly man be humiliated at a cafe for not knowing the menu and struggling to count his change. He left without getting anything, and everyone just sat there. When did we stop treating our elders with respect? This shouldn't be okay. Her finger hovered over the post button. Was this really the right thing to do? Would anyone even care? She sighed, her mind flickering back to the man's face, and pressed send. Almost immediately, she felt a pang of doubt. What good would it do to put it out there? She wasn't the type to make waves. Emma tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept circling back to what she'd seen. She could still hear the man's shaky voice and see his trembling hands fumbling with the coins. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became, not just at the barista, but at herself. Why hadn't she spoken up? She had just sat there, like everyone else, too caught up in her own silence to make a difference. An hour later, her phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. And again. She frowned, pulling it out to check. The post had started to gain traction. There were comments, dozens of them, people expressing outrage, sharing similar experiences, and tagging others to read her story. Some thanked her for bringing attention to an important issue, while others called for action. Her hands tightened around the phone as she scrolled. A few comments stood out to her. Heartbreaking. How can people be so cruel? We need to do better as a society. Who was the man? I'd love to help him. Emma paused on that last one. She didn't know anything about him, not even his name. She had been too paralyzed by the moment to approach him. Guilt gnawed at her as she realized how little she had done. Maybe it's not too late, she muttered under her breath. Closing her laptop and slipping her phone into her bag, she grabbed her camera and left the cafe. The man had disappeared into the crowded streets, but Emma was determined to find him. Walter sat in his small living room, the faint hum of his old television filling the quiet. He wasn't really watching the screen, just staring at it, lost in thought. The scene at the cafe replayed in his mind over and over, each detail sharper than the last. He could still hear the barista's dismissive tone and feel the sting of the laughter around him. It wasn't the first time he had felt invisible, but this time, it had cut deeper. The knock at his door startled him. He rarely had visitors, and the sound was so unexpected that it took him a moment to rise. Leaning on his cane, Walter shuffled to the door and opened it cautiously. Standing there was a young woman, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail and a camera slung over her shoulder. "Hi," she said, her voice warm but uncertain. I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Emma Carter. I think I saw you at the Sunrise Cafe earlier today." Walter furrowed his brow, unsure of what to make of her. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone wary. Emma hesitated, shifting slightly on her feet. "I saw what happened, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry. The way they treated you, it wasn't right. And I should have said something, but I didn't. I feel terrible about that." Walter stared at her for a moment, his grip tightening on the doorframe. He wasn't used to strangers showing up on his doorstep, let alone apologizing for something that wasn't their fault. "Why do you care?" he finally asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Emma's face softened. "Because it wasn't fair. No one deserves to be treated like that, and I wanted to let you know that I saw you. I didn't just sit there and ignore it, even if it felt that way." Walter sighed and opened the door wider. "Well, I guess you'd better come in. No point in talking out here." Emma stepped inside, taking in the modest surroundings. The room was filled with mementos of a life well lived, framed photos on the walls, books stacked neatly on shelves, and a worn armchair in the corner. A small table near the window held a picture of a smiling woman, Walter's late wife, Emma guessed. Walter motioned toward the couch. "Have a seat. I'm not much for entertaining, but I can offer you some water." Emma shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." For a moment, silence hung between them. Emma wasn't sure how to start, but Walter broke the quiet. "So, what do you want from me? People don't just show up like this for no reason." Emma took a deep breath. "I posted about what happened on social media. I didn't use your name, I don't even know your name, but the story got a lot of attention. People are upset about how you were treated, and some of them want to help." Walter frowned. "Help? How?" "They want to make sure it doesn't happen again. They're sharing their own experiences, talking about how we can do better as a society. Some even want to know how to reach you. I thought you should know." Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you expect me to do about it," he said after a long pause. "I'm just an old man trying to get by. I don't want any attention, and I don't need people feeling sorry for me." Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "It's not about pity. It's about respect. What happened to you struck a nerve because it happens to so many others. Maybe this is a chance to make things better, not just for you, but for others like you." Walter studied her, his eyes narrowing. "You're young," he said finally. "You've got the energy for this sort of thing. But me? I'm tired. I've lived my life. What difference could I make now?" Emma hesitated, searching for the right words. "I think, maybe you could make all the difference," she said softly. Walter looked away, his gaze settling on the photo of his wife. For a moment, Emma thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or longing. Then he sighed. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. But I need some time to think." Emma nodded, rising from the couch. "Of course. I understand. If you ever want to talk, or if there's anything I can do, here's my number." She handed him a small card with her name and contact information. Walter took it reluctantly, slipping it into his shirt pocket. "I'll think about it," he said gruffly. As Emma stepped out onto the porch, she turned back to face him. "Thank you for letting me come in," she said. "And I really am sorry for what happened." Walter gave a small nod but said nothing. He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing down the street. As he closed the door, he leaned against it for a moment, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to make of Emma or her strange offer, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a faint stirring of something he thought he'd lost: hope. Walter spent the next few days in quiet reflection. Emma's visit had left him unsettled, not in a bad way, but in a way that felt unfamiliar. He wasn't used to people caring about what he thought or wanted. Her words played on repeat in his mind. Maybe you could make all the difference. Sitting in his small kitchen one morning, he stared at the business card she had left behind. It was propped against the base of a coffee mug, her neatly printed name and phone number staring back at him. His hand hovered over it, hesitating. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. What difference could I make now? But no matter how much he tried to dismiss the idea, it wouldn't leave him alone. Meanwhile, Emma was already busy at work. She hadn't heard from Walter, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She'd been overwhelmed by the outpouring of support for her post, with dozens of messages from people who wanted to share their own experiences of elder neglect or disrespect. It wasn't just about Walter anymore, it was about something much bigger. Emma sat at her cluttered desk, scribbling notes in a spiral notebook. She had an idea forming, though it was still rough around the edges. What if she could create a platform to highlight the stories of elderly people like Walter? A way to remind the world of the dignity and value of those who had come before them. The name came to her suddenly: Respect the Elders. She underlined it 3 times in her notebook, feeling a spark of excitement. The concept was simple: collect stories, photographs, and videos of older individuals, showcasing their lives and experiences. It would be a way to combat the invisibility many of them felt and to inspire a cultural shift toward kindness and respect. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed Walter. Emma decided to stop waiting for him to call. She grabbed her notebook and camera and headed back to his house. As she walked up to his front door, she rehearsed what she would say. "Don't push him too hard. Let him decide on his own." Walter answered after a few knocks, his expression neutral but not unkind. "You again," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I told you I'd be back," Emma replied with a small smile. They sat in his living room, the same as before, though this time the atmosphere felt less formal. Walter gestured toward the photo of his late wife. "You were looking at her last time," he said. "That's Mary. She passed away 10 years ago." Emma nodded. "She's beautiful." "She was," Walter said, his voice softening. "She always knew how to make people feel special. Me included." Emma leaned forward. "I think you have that same ability, Walter. You just don't realize it yet." He gave a skeptical chuckle. "I'm not sure about that." Emma opened her notebook and showed him her idea. She explained how respect the elders could work, how it could give a voice to people who often felt ignored or overlooked. She spoke passionately, her words tumbling out faster than she could organize them. When she finished, Walter sat back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's a nice idea," he said. "But why me? Why do you think I can help?" "Because your story is what started all this," Emma said. "And because people connect with you. If they see you sharing your experiences, they'll feel inspired to share theirs, too. You don't have to do much, just be yourself." Walter looked at the notebook, then back at Emma. "You're serious about this?" "Absolutely," Emma said. "But only if you're willing. If you'd rather not, I understand." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. After a long moment, he turned back to her. "You really think this could make a difference?" "I do," Emma said firmly. Walter sighed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to try." Emma's face lit up. "Really?" "Really," he said. "But don't expect too much from me. I'm not much for speeches or cameras." "That's fine," Emma said quickly. "Just you being involved is enough." For the first time in a long while, Walter felt a flicker of excitement, an almost forgotten sense of purpose. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for now, he was willing to take the first step. Walter sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small notebook Emma had left him. Its pages were filled with ideas and plans for the Respect the Elders campaign. He still wasn't sure what he'd gotten himself into, but something about Emma's determination was contagious. It wasn't every day that someone asked for his help, or believed he still had something to offer. Across town, Emma was preparing for their first official day of work. She'd managed to borrow some equipment from a friend, a proper microphone and a portable light to improve the quality of their videos. Her camera bag was packed, and her notebook was bursting with names of people who had reached out, eager to share their stories. When she arrived at Walter's house, she found him waiting on the porch, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and his favorite cap. He looked both nervous and resolved. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said as she approached. "I don't," Emma admitted with a grin, "but I'm good at figuring it out as I go." They spent the morning brainstorming, with Walter offering suggestions and Emma refining the details. The first step, they decided, was to tell Walter's story, not the one from the cafe incident, but the life behind it. Emma set up her camera in Walter's living room, angling it toward a comfortable chair near the window. The soft afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. "Just be yourself," she told him as she adjusted the focus. Walter nodded, though he looked uneasy. "I'm not used to talking about myself. Mary always said I was a good listener, not much of a talker." "Then just pretend you're talking to her," Emma said gently. Walter's face softened, and he took a deep breath. "All right, let's give it a try." As the camera rolled, Walter began to speak. He talked about his childhood, growing up in a small town during the Great Depression. He shared memories of meeting Mary at a community dance, their wedding day, and the joys and challenges of raising their 2 children. He spoke about his time in the military, his years working as a mechanic, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Emma listened intently, her camera capturing every word. She could see the depth of emotion in Walter's eyes as he spoke, the pride in his voice when he mentioned his children, and the sorrow that lingered when he talked about losing Mary. When he finished, Emma turned off the camera and smiled. "That was incredible, Walter. People are going to love hearing your story." Walter shrugged modestly. "It's just my life. Nothing special." "It's more than special," Emma said. "It's real. That's what people need to see." Encouraged by their progress, they decided to visit a local senior center the next day to find others willing to share their stories. Walter, despite his initial reservations, agreed to come along. At the center, they were greeted warmly by the staff, who were thrilled about the project. Emma set up her equipment in a quiet corner, while Walter struck up conversations with the residents. He was hesitant at first, but as he started talking, he found himself drawn into their stories. One woman, Agnes, recounted her years as a schoolteacher and how she still wrote letters to her former students. A man named Frank spoke proudly of his service in the Navy and the model ships he now built in his spare time. Walter listened intently, nodding and offering kind words of encouragement. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something meaningful. By the end of the day, Emma's camera was filled with footage, and her heart was full. Walter, too, felt lighter, as though a part of himself had been rediscovered. That evening, Emma began editing the footage, carefully piecing together Walter's story along with the voices of the other seniors. She added a simple tagline, "Every story deserves to be heard." When she showed Walter the finished video, he watched in silence, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You've got something special here, Emma," he said quietly. "This could really make a difference." Emma smiled, her confidence bolstered by his words. "It's only the beginning, Walter. With your help, we can take this even further." Walter nodded, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive, like his life still had meaning and purpose. The video Emma had created with Walter and the senior center residents was posted online one quiet afternoon. At first, the response trickled in, comments from friends, shares from followers, and a handful of heartfelt messages. But within a day, the momentum snowballed. The video reached thousands, then tens of thousands. People from across the country commented on how it moved them, sharing their own stories of loved ones who felt invisible in today's world. Walter was stunned by the reaction. He hadn't expected much when Emma had asked to record his story. Now, strangers were writing messages directly to him, thanking him for his honesty and strength. Emma was thrilled, but she knew this was just the beginning. However, not all the feedback was positive. Scrolling through the comments one evening, Emma's heart sank. Mixed among the encouragement and praise were criticisms. "Just another sob story to go viral. These videos don't fix anything. What's the point? This is just exploiting elderly people for clicks." Emma sat back in her chair, the glow of the computer screen harsh against her tired eyes. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She had poured her heart into this project, but now doubts crept in. Were they really making a difference? Or was it just temporary noise? Walter, sitting across from her in the living room, noticed her furrowed brow. "Something wrong?" he asked. Emma hesitated before answering. "Some people don't think we're doing enough. They think this is just performative." Walter leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. "People will always find something to criticize, Emma. But let me ask you this, why did you start this project?" Emma sighed. "Because what happened to you wasn't right. And because there are so many others like you who deserve to be seen, to feel valued." Walter nodded. "Then you're doing the right thing. Doesn't matter what the naysayers think. Focus on the ones you're helping. His words gave her some comfort, but the doubts still lingered. A week later, Emma and Walter organized their first in-person event, a small gathering at the senior center, where members of the community could come together to hear the residents' stories and share their own. Emma hoped the event would help build more support for the campaign, and prove to herself that it was worth continuing. The turnout was modest at first, with only a handful of people trickling in. Walter sat quietly at a table, greeting visitors with a polite smile while Emma darted around, adjusting signs and chatting with attendees. She couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. But as the event went on, the room began to fill. Families arrived with their elderly relatives, and younger attendees approached Walter and the other residents to ask questions. Soon, the air buzzed with conversation and laughter. One moment stood out. A teenager named Mia approached Walter. She was shy at first, but eventually, she told him that the video Emma had made inspired her to spend more time with her grandfather. "I didn't realize how much I was taking him for granted," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Walter smiled warmly. "Your grandfather is lucky to have you, Mia. Make sure he knows how much he means to you." As the event wound down, Emma stood at the back of the room, taking it all in. It wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to do, but seeing the connections forming between people gave her hope. That night, back at Walter's house, Emma brought up the critical comments again. "You were right," she admitted. "I was so focused on the negativity that I almost forgot why I started this in the first place." Walter gave her a wry smile. "I may not know much about social media, but I know this: the people who matter are the ones who show up. And tonight, they showed up." Emma laughed softly. "You're starting to sound like a motivational speaker, Walter." "Don't push your luck," he said with a chuckle. Despite the challenges, the Respect the Elders campaign continued to grow. Emma and Walter knew there would be more obstacles ahead, but they also knew they had something worth fighting for. Walter sat at his kitchen table, nervously tapping his fingers against the wood. On the counter sat a stack of note cards Emma had prepared for him, each one neatly outlining points for the speech he was supposed to give at the biggest event yet for Respect the Elders. The event, scheduled to take place in the city's largest community center, had garnered significant attention. Local news outlets were covering it, and over 100 people had RSVP'd. Walter wasn't sure how he had ended up in this position. Speaking in front of a crowd was the last thing he wanted to do. Emma entered the room, carrying her laptop and a cup of coffee. "You've got this, Walter," she said, setting the coffee in front of him. "I'm not so sure," Walter replied, his voice heavy. "Why do they want to hear from me? I'm not a politician or an activist. I'm just an old man who wanted a sandwich." Emma sat across from him, meeting his eyes. "That's exactly why they want to hear from you. You represent something real, something they can connect to. Your story is what inspired all of this." Walter shook his head, picking up one of the note cards. "I don't know if I can do it, Emma. What if I mess up? What if I forget what to say?" "Then you speak from the heart," Emma said gently. "No one's expecting perfection. They're just expecting you to be you." Walter sighed, unsure if that would be enough. The community center buzzed with activity as people filed in, filling the rows of chairs set up for the event. The walls were decorated with photographs Emma had taken of seniors sharing their stories, faces full of character, accompanied by short captions highlighting their lives and experiences. A small stage at the front held a podium, a microphone, and a banner with the campaign's name, Respect the Elders. Walter sat backstage, adjusting his cap nervously. He could hear the hum of the crowd, the chatter growing louder as more people arrived. Emma stood nearby, trying to hide her own nerves. She knew how much this speech meant, not just for the campaign, but for Walter himself. Finally, the event began. Emma stepped onto the stage to warm applause, welcoming the audience and introducing the project. She spoke briefly about the campaign's mission and shared some of the stories they had collected. Then, taking a deep breath, she said, "And now, I'd like to introduce someone who has been at the heart of this movement. Please welcome Walter Thompson." The room erupted into applause as Walter slowly made his way onto the stage, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. The lights were bright, the crowd larger than he had expected. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced down at the note cards in his hand but quickly realized they were useless. His hands trembled too much to read them. Clearing his throat, he placed the cards on the podium and gripped the sides for support. "I wasn't sure what to say tonight," Walter began, his voice steady but soft. "I'm not a public speaker, and I'm not used to having so many people looking at me. But Emma told me to speak from the heart, so that's what I'm going to do." The room fell silent, everyone hanging on his words. "A few weeks ago, I walked into a cafe to order a sandwich," he continued. "And what happened there made me feel small. It made me feel like I didn't matter anymore, like the world had moved on without me. But then something unexpected happened. Emma saw me. She saw me when no one else did, and she decided to do something about it." Walter paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about why that moment mattered so much. And I realized it's because we all want to feel seen. We all want to feel like we belong, no matter how old we are or what stage of life we're in." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I'm not here to ask for pity, and I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me. What I need, what we all need, is respect. Kindness. A little bit of humanity. Because the truth is, every person in this room will one day be where I am now. And when that day comes, I hope you'll live in a world where people still see you." The audience was utterly silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Walter took a deep breath, his voice softening again. "I'm grateful to Emma for giving me the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. And I hope that, together, we can create a world where no one feels invisible. Thank you." As he stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. People stood, clapping and cheering, many wiping away tears. Emma was waiting for him backstage, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You were incredible," she said as he approached. Walter gave her a small smile, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all night. "I don't know about that, but I said what I needed to say." "It was more than enough," Emma said. For Walter, it was a moment of quiet triumph, a reminder that, no matter his age, he still had something to offer. The days following Walter's speech were a whirlwind. The video of his heartfelt words, recorded by several attendees, quickly made its way online. It didn't just go viral, it resonated deeply. People from across the country shared it, tagging loved ones, reflecting on their own relationships with older family members, and pledging to do better. The comments were filled with gratitude, tears, and promises of change. For Walter, the response was both overwhelming and humbling. He had never expected to become the face of something so significant. Every morning, Emma would bring him updates on the campaign's progress, articles being written, invitations to speak at events, and messages of support flooding in. "People are really listening, Walter," Emma said one afternoon as they sat in his living room. "You're making a difference." Walter adjusted his cap, still trying to process the attention. "It's not just me," he said. "You're the one who started all this. I'm just helping along the way." Emma smiled. "It's not about who started it. It's about what we're doing together." The Sunrise Café, the place where it all began, had also undergone a transformation. After learning about Walter's story and the backlash the cafe faced, the management made significant changes. They reached out to Emma and Walter, offering to partner with Respect the Elders. One afternoon, Walter and Emma returned to the cafe for the first time since the incident. The staff welcomed them warmly, the air thick with anticipation. A manager approached, shaking Walter's hand. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice earnest. "I can't change what happened to you, but I want to make sure this place becomes a space where everyone feels valued, especially our elders." The cafe introduced new policies, including training for employees on how to treat all customers with respect. They even created a menu specifically for seniors, with larger text and simplified options. A framed photo of Walter, along with a plaque reading "Every story matters," was displayed near the counter as a reminder. Walter was reluctant at first to accept the gesture, but Emma encouraged him. "It's not just about what happened to you," she said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Meanwhile, the campaign itself continued to grow. Emma and Walter received invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and even corporate events. Each time, Walter felt the same nervousness he'd experienced before, but he pushed through it, knowing his words were making an impact. One particularly memorable event took place at a local high school, where Walter shared his story with a gym full of students. At first, he wasn't sure they would listen. Teenagers were a tough crowd, after all. But as he spoke, he saw their expressions shift, their attention sharpening. Afterward, a young boy approached him hesitantly. "I don't talk to my grandpa much," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm going to start." Walter placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll be glad you did," he said. Back at home, Walter reflected on how much his life had changed. For years, he had felt invisible, like his time in the world had passed. But now, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than himself. One evening, Emma brought over a stack of letters they had received through the campaign's website. Together, they read through them, each story a testament to the impact Respect the Elders was having. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a woman in Ohio who wrote about her father, a retired carpenter who had stopped leaving the house after feeling ignored by the people around him. "After seeing your campaign," the letter read, "my dad agreed to go out with me for the first time in months. He even smiled. Thank you for reminding him, and me, that he still matters." Walter set the letter down, his eyes misty. "This," he said softly, "this is why we're doing it." Emma nodded, her heart full. "And we're just getting started." As the movement grew, so did the community around it. Strangers became friends, families grew closer, and countless stories were shared. Walter and Emma's unlikely partnership had sparked something far bigger than they had imagined, a reminder that respect and kindness could change the world, one story at a time. Walter sat on his porch in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. The sound of distant birds and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the air. It was a rare moment of quiet after weeks of speeches, events, and the whirlwind of attention that had transformed his life. He glanced at the sidewalk, half expecting Emma to appear, notebook in hand and camera slung over her shoulder. She didn't disappoint. A few moments later, she came around the corner, waving as she approached. "Am I interrupting your piece?" she called with a grin. Walter chuckled, setting down his tea. "You're part of the piece now. Come on up." Emma joined him on the porch, placing her bag beside her chair. She looked out at the street, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," she said. "It feels like just yesterday we were sitting in your living room, trying to figure out how to get this whole thing started. And now look at us," Walter said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Making headlines. Changing policies. Even getting that cafe to shape up. Not bad for an old man and a camera-toting kid." Emma laughed. "Not bad at all." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small scrapbook. "I made something for you," she said, handing it to him. Walter opened it carefully, his hands tracing the edges of the pages. Inside were photos from their journey, portraits of the seniors they'd met, snapshots from events, and even a few candid shots of Walter himself. Alongside the pictures were handwritten notes from people whose lives had been touched by the campaign. One note read, "Thank you for reminding us that every voice matters. Your courage has inspired me to reconnect with my grandmother." Another said, "Walter, your story gave me hope. Please know you've made a difference." Walter's eyes misted as he turned the pages. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. "I wanted to," Emma replied. "You've done so much, Walter. I wanted you to have something to look back on, something to remind you of everything you've accomplished." He closed the scrapbook and set it on his lap, letting the silence settle between them for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Emma, when you first knocked on my door, I thought you were crazy. I didn't see how any of this could matter. But now I can't imagine my life without it." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it without you. This was always a partnership." Walter leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's funny," he said. "I spent so much of my life thinking my best years were behind me. But maybe the best years are the ones where you leave something behind for others." Emma nodded. "That's exactly what you've done." They sat together in comfortable silence, the scrapbook resting between them like a shared memory. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden light over the porch. "Where do we go from here?" Walter asked after a while. Emma shrugged, a playful smile on her lips. "Wherever the stories take us." Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "I should have known you'd say that." The final image of the campaign's impact came a week later, as Emma and Walter attended the opening of a new community center for seniors. The walls were adorned with photos and stories from the Respect the Elders project, and the center's mission was to provide a space where seniors could feel valued, connected, and seen. Walter stood at the entrance, looking up at the plaque above the door. It read, "In honor of Walter Thompson, whose story reminded us all of the power of respect." He turned to Emma, his smile soft but full of pride. "I guess we did all right." Emma beamed. "We did more than all right." As they stepped inside, the room filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of new connections being made. For Walter, it was a moment of quiet triumph, a legacy not just of kindness, but of hope.